Oh, sorry about that. Frog in my throat. Hello everyone and welcome to Rewind Reviews. In this video we're taking a look at one of the most highly anticipated movies of 2024, and that movie is Dune Part 2. Released in 2024 and based on the second half of the 1965 novel by Frank Herbert, Dune Part 2 follows Paul Atreides, who unites with Chani and the Fremen while seeking revenge against the conspirators who destroyed his family. Once again adapted for screen by Jon Spaihts and Denis Villeneuve, who also directs. The movie stars Timothée Chalamet, Zendaya, Rebecca Ferguson, Javier Bardem, Josh Brolin, Austin Butler, Florence Pugh, Dave Bautista, Christopher Walken, Lee Seydoux, Stellan Skarsgård, Suela Yacoub and Charlotte Rampling. Now, I am not going to beat around the bush here. I was genuinely excited about this one. I absolutely loved Part 1. I thought it was a fantastic movie that was able to establish so much with these characters and this world in a really authentic way, and I absolutely would say that it is one of the best sci-fi movies that I have seen in the past few years. And of course, as soon as the credits started rolling on Part 1, the only question going through my mind was, are we going to get Part 2? At that point in time, there was no confirmation on Part 2 actually being given a green light. There was no announcement whatsoever about this movie being in development. That was very much up in the air, and it was absolutely dependent on how well Part 1 did in the box office, which wasn't helped by the fact that Warner Brothers had decided to release Part 1 simultaneously in both cinemas and on their own streaming service, HBO Max. But Part 1 actually didn't do too badly in the box office, and it was enough to convince Warner Brothers to commission Part 2. Flash forward 3 years, and Dune Part 2 is now officially out for the world to see. But the question remains, was it worth the wait? Oh yes. This movie was absolutely fantastic, and I am not over exaggerating here. There hasn't been a lot of big movies coming out in 2024 thus far, but honestly at this point in time, this is the best movie of the year so far. And complete honesty, looking ahead at all the movies coming out in 2024, this film honestly is going to be a hard one to top. The story for Part 2 picks up more or less where Part 1 ended, with Paul and Lady Jessica now with the Fremen and beginning to learn their ways. Whilst training, Paul continues to dream of a terrible and devastating future that seems to be edging closer and closer, forcing him to come to terms with the prophecy about his own inescapable destiny as the Lisan al-Gaib. Meanwhile, the Harkonnens, still desperately attempting to get spice harvesting back into full operation, enlist the help of Feyd Rautha, the psychotic nephew of the Baron, to take over as the ruler of Arrakis and stop the Fremen, setting the stage for a battle that will ultimately decide the fate of the world and the rest of the galaxy. I know a lot of people found Part 1 to be quite a complicated movie. There was a lot going on, there was a lot of concepts, a lot of ideas that they were trying to sort of introduce in that film. Part 2 is less complicated than Part 1, but I do think that there are still a lot of ideas and concepts that this movie does introduce, that it does kind of play around with, that you do need to pay attention to. But most of the legwork, all the character introductions, the introduction of the voice, the world, Arrakis, spice, the worms, everything that you could possibly need to understand about this movie and this story, that's all been done. All the legwork is done and out the way. So if you have seen Part 1, this movie honestly is so much more satisfying because you understand everything that is already going on. I don't feel like you can go into Part 2 without seeing Part 1. I know director Denis Villeneuve has said that you can go into Part 2 without seeing Part 1. I kind of disagree. I do feel like you do need to see Part 1 because that is kind of where everything starts. It's basically the equivalent of just coming into a movie halfway through and then just expecting to just pick everything up. It is possible, but you would be a bit lost. Part 2 builds on everything that Part 1 did. The character development is carried over from Part 1, so we do see these characters going further along in their journey. There's a lot of newer characters getting introduced, a lot of new concepts and ideas. We get to explore the Fremen culture a little bit more. We never really saw much of them in Part 1. This one is completely all about the Fremen. Plus, and this is the reason why this movie is such a satisfying watch, especially for people who've watched Part 1, it pays off everything that was set up in Part 1. Every single little thing that was set up and built up in Part 1 is paid off in this movie in some way, including the visions, the prophecy, the training that the characters had to go through. It even goes so far as to answer a load of the little questions that I had about Part 1, including what was the deal with the little desert mouse, and it even answers why this story is called Dune. It's just so satisfying. There is a lot going on in this movie. There is a lot of stuff that it does need to pay off, absolutely, but there's a lot of other stuff that it does need to set up and establish on its own, which does result in a longer runtime. Part 2 is a little bit longer than Part 1 was. Part 1, as much as I loved it, I do feel did have a little bit of a pacing problem. There were a lot of scenes that did feel a little bit more dragged out than they really needed to be. Part 2, I do feel does have a similar pace to Part 1, but the difference being that this movie does have a lot more going on. It's a lot more action-packed, and I'm going to be completely honest, the runtime, I didn't really feel it. The movie could have been longer and I would have been absolutely fine with it. The story for part 2 was absolutely fantastic. I love what it does with the characters. I love how it does further everything that was set up in part 1. There's a few really nice twists thrown in as well, which I wasn't expecting, and it honestly does build up into something that really is satisfying. It was honestly such a good cinema experience, this movie. This is honestly one of the best cinema experiences that I have had in a long time. If you're a regular viewer for this channel, you're probably aware that there have been a few times where I have gone to see movies in the cinemas and I haven't really had the best of times. This honestly was such a fantastic experience all around, not just necessarily how the movie actually was in itself, but the way that the audience was as well. I went to go and see this in IMAX on opening day. It was one of the first showings for it. Every single person who was there was excited for it. Everyone was just quiet, they were respectful, and by the time the credits were rolling at the end, you could pretty much feel every single person just going, ah. They're even quiet during the trailers, and that never happens. And even better, my screening was completely full. Every single seat was taken up, which is a far cry from what I experienced with Madam Web. It was such a great experience. These movies are designed for the cinema, especially in IMAX. If you can, go and see these movies in IMAX. It is so worth it. I have seen some people asking how much of this movie is in IMAX format and how much of it is in widescreen format. As far as I remember, pretty much all of it was in IMAX apart from the end credits. And there are a few sequences, a lot of close-ups of some of the characters where I do kind of wonder like how much of it actually should be in widescreen, because some of those shots I don't really see looking very good in widescreen. But as I said, if you can go and see this in IMAX, please do. It is so worth it. This is a movie that is designed for the biggest screen that you can possibly see it on. Go and see this movie or I shall use the voice. Anyway, when it comes to the characters that are featured in this movie, a lot of the characters that are featured are returning characters from part 1. And obviously leading things once again is Timothée Chalamet as Paul Atreides. Paul this time around is such a different character. All the development that he has been through in part 1 has shaped who he is now in part 2. He feels so much more powerful and a lot more driven in his goal to get revenge on the Harkonnens. Plus, the movie continues to build on the conflicted feelings that he has towards the destiny that he supposedly has. He is a character that is being driven to do what he must, and it takes him to some very dark places. So much so that by the time that we get to the final battle, he feels so much more threatening and fearsome than ever before. And when it comes to Timothée Chalamet's performance in this movie, this is so different than anything else that I've ever seen from him before. He is no longer the innocent character that he once was at the start of part 1. He is a fearless leader, and I feel like the performance that Timothée Chalamet actually gives, you do buy into it, to the point where there are scenes in this movie backed up by that incredible score by Hans Zimmer where I genuinely got chills purely based on that performance. This might honestly be Timothée Chalamet's best performance to date, and I am so happy that he was cast. He has done an absolutely incredible job across both movies, and I am so happy with how it turned out. Across this movie, Paul is still very dismissive of the potential destiny that he supposedly is going to have as this messianic super being. To him, it is just superstition. It is a story that is being fabricated by the Bene Gesserit in order to control and manipulate the Fremen. And over the course of part 1, you see him slowly starting to use it more just to his advantage to get to where it is that he needs to go. And part 2 continues that journey to the point where he is faced with a decision about whether or not to actually become the Lisan al-Gaib. And whatever choice he makes will have a gigantic impact on not only Arrakis, but the entire galaxy. And that ultimately is what this story is actually about. I mentioned in my review for part 1 that a lot of the messaging and a lot of the undertones about this story were quite subtle. They weren't really sort of addressed in any sort of big way, but there was hints about where it was that it was going. This one, part 2, really does drive that home. The story of Dune initially is presented as a chosen one storyline, but actually it is a cautionary tale. It's a story that deals with themes of belief, faith, religion, manipulation, using those things, especially when it comes to the Bene Gesserit, who continue to interfere and reshape what needs to fit into their plans. There's themes of destiny, fate, and exploration of politics through the introduction of the Emperor, and it even warns of the dangers of hero worship. There's some very heavy topics and themes that are addressed throughout this movie, that are brought up, that are explored, and I do feel like how it is that the movie does go about actually addressing everything is very good. And it doesn't really feel very heavy-handed either. It's woven into the fabric of the story and it does make sense. It's deep, it's thought-provoking, and it is all handled very, very effectively, especially how it is that all of the other characters are integrated into this. All of the characters that are featured in this movie do have a role to play. Some of them do have a lot bigger parts to play and have a much more significant impact on the story, and some of them have smaller roles here and there, but they still do have an impact to some capacity. The ones with the largest roles include people like Stilgar, played by Javier Bardem. Stilgar is one of the characters characters that absolutely believes that Paul is the Lisan al-Gaib, no matter how much Paul tells him that he isn't. He is a really good character. I do think that Javier Bardem is absolutely fantastic in this role. I love seeing a lot more of him in this movie. He is much more prominent this time around than he was in part 1. And he also does add some much needed comedy and a little bit of levity to it. It's not like a lot of comedy, it's just kind of like little speckles of humour just kind of peppered through. The humour is pretty funny in this movie, and the best thing is that all of it does come from the characters. But as I said, when it comes to Stilgar as a character, I do think that what it is that they do with him in this movie is really good, very interesting, and I do think that he is one of the better characters in this movie. But then you also have one of the other most significant characters in this movie, and that is Chani, played by Zendaya. She was one of the characters that I was really looking forward to seeing a lot more of in part 2, because she only really had like a brief role in part 1, just kind of showing up in a few little dream sequences here and there, and only properly showing up towards the end. So this movie, we do get to see her actually being a proper character this time around. She does get to develop a relationship with Paul. I do think that how that is developed and built up over the movie is very realistic and believable. There is a really good chemistry between Zendaya and Timothée Chalamet that does help sell that. But Chani as a character is one of the most crucial elements to this movie. She is a very important character overall. She's one of the characters that doesn't believe that Paul is the Lisan al-Gaib. She's one of the few characters that actually just sees him as he is. Which I think for a story like this, you do need to have two polar opposite viewpoints, and I do feel like how it is handled is very good and very effective. I know that Chani as a character is very different from what it is that she is in the books. I'm just going to purely go off of what it is that other people have said. I haven't actually read the books myself, but based on what it is that people have said, it does sound like her character has gone in a very different direction. But that's not really a bad thing, to be honest, because I feel like how it is that they have handled her character in this and the way that the performance from Zendaya is handled, I do think does work very well, and I do think that it does add another layer to this movie. And then you also have some other returning characters like Gurney, played by the poet Josh Brolin. Always with those poems. He's a character that I really liked in part 1. I was afraid that he'd been killed off screen because you never actually see him again after the big invasion by the Harkonnens. So it is definitely a welcomed return for this character in this movie, and I do love what it is that he does add, especially when it comes to Paul and his character. But one character that I was very interested in seeing a lot more of and seeing what direction it was that they were going to go with her character is Lady Jessica, played by Rebecca Ferguson. As I said in my review for part 1, she was the most interesting and most complex character from the entire lineup of characters in part 1. And I feel like where it was that they left off with her character, it could have genuinely gone absolutely anywhere, so I was really curious to see what it was that they were going to do with her in part 2. And it's safe to say, without getting into spoiler territory, that the direction that they go with her character, I definitely was not expecting. It's a very different performance to what it is that Rebecca Ferguson was giving in part 1. This is a very different character this time around, but it all completely makes sense. The character is still one of the most interesting characters in this story, and I was really happy to see where it was that they did go with her character, despite me not actually knowing where it was that they were going. The performance from Rebecca Ferguson is once again absolutely brilliant. I do think that she really does bring this character to life in a really good way, and I do feel like, especially in this movie, she does have a lot more of a fearsome persona this time around, to the point where there are scenes where I actually found her a little bit scary, but it does fit overall, and I do feel like the way that they do go about handling her character this time around is very good. The Bene Gesserits are still quite a prominent presence within this story. They do have a slightly larger role this time around. We kind of get to see a little bit more of their inner workings. We also get to kind of see what it is that they're doing outside of all the stuff with Paul, and with that comes the return of Charlotte Rampling and the introduction of Lee Seydoux. Again, like absolutely everybody else in this movie, I do think that both of those actresses are doing an absolutely fantastic job. I think that everything that they do with their characters does feel very real, does feel very natural, still have that sort of ethereal sort of presence that the Bene Gesserit do tend to have. And seeing how it is that these characters are changing and manipulating things to their own designs is one of the most interesting subplots of this story. And a lot of that focuses and circulates around what's going on with the Harkonnens, but I'll get into that in a minute. Because very quickly, I do need to mention that there are some other new characters that are introduced in this movie, including the Emperor, played by Christopher Walken. I was excited to see what it was that they were going to do with the Emperor in this movie and what it was that Christopher Walken was going to be doing performance-wise. I will admit I was a little bit disappointed how much screen time he actually does have in this movie, but again, he does have a large role to play. It is a very significant part of the overall story, but the overall screen time is very little. And that also goes for Princess Irulan, who is also introduced in this movie, played by one of my favourite actresses, Florence Pugh. She gets a little bit more screen time than the Emperor does, and I do like what it is that she does add to this movie. She does kind of, I like the narration and kind of like fills in on the backstory about what's going on. But again, being like the Emperor, she doesn't really have that much screen time, and the overall sort of presence that she does have in the movie is not really that much. But in all honesty, considering just how much is actually going on in this movie, it doesn't surprise me that there probably would have to be some reduced roles in this movie. There are so many things that are happening at once that you cannot focus on everything. So it does completely make sense why those roles might have been reduced a little bit just to make sure that there is enough screen time for other characters. Right, Harkonnens. The Harkonnens do make a big return in this movie, but one significant change here is what it is that's actually driving them this time around. Because in the first movie, they were quite angry and quite resentful to the fact that the Atreides had been given permission to rule over Arrakis. This time around, after the invasion, after they have now taken control of Arrakis and all the spice mining duties, they've become quite desperate to get the spice mining operation back up and running, but the Fremen keep interfering with it and stopping them. So we do get to see a slightly different side to these characters this time around, including Rabban, played by Dave Bautista. He was quite a primal force of nature in the first movie. He was quite aggressive, quite scary. This movie, I honestly felt a little bit sorry for him in some moments. I really wasn't expecting that. And then of course we also have Stellan Skarsgård making a return as the Baron, who I was honestly expecting was going to have a little bit more screen time than he actually does in this movie. He was kind of like the big antagonist of part one. In this movie, that's not so much the case. He does still have a role to play. All of the Harkonnens do have a big part to play in the overall story, and I do like what it is that they do with them overall. It does feel like they have to take a little bit of a back seat, especially when one other character gets introduced, but I do really like what it is that they do with the Harkonnens this time around, and I do think the performances from absolutely everyone are fantastic. And who is that other character that gets introduced? That character is Feyd Rauther, played by Austin Butler. Feyd was one of the characters that I was most interested in seeing being introduced into this story. He was one of the characters that I was quite interested in seeing what direction it was that they were going to go with this interpretation of him. Feyd was very famously played by Sting in the 1984 movie, and that was a very over-the-top kind of camp and quite fun version of the character. This interpretation of him is so different. Feyd in Dune Part 2 is one of the most intimidating characters in this movie. He's a very unpredictable character. You're never quite sure what it is that he's going to do. He does have this natural ferocity to him, especially when it comes to some of the fight scenes. You really do buy into that. He is quite two-dimensional compared to some of the other characters in this movie, but I do like the direction that they do go with him. The performance from Austin Butler is absolutely fantastic. You do buy into who this character is, and I like how it is that all the other characters are portrayed whenever it is that they are around him, because they are scared of him for good reason, and I feel like that does really help sell the character a lot more, and they do make him feel a lot more fearsome and a lot more threatening. It's so different to anything I've ever seen Austin Butler playing before, but I feel like that actually does kind of work because you're not quite sure what it is to expect from him. The performance is really good. The character is a little bit underdeveloped compared to some of the other characters, but he does get a fantastic intro, and he takes part in some of the most brutal sequences that really do kind of show off who his character is. There's a lot more fight sequences and action sequences in this movie compared to how much there was in part one. This is because this is the culmination of the story. Everything is kind of coming together and clashing, and as spectacular as some of the bigger set pieces are, which are absolutely fantastic, I've got to admit the standout sequences for me are some of the more smaller scale fights. The best one being a knife fight between Paul and Feyd, which is so brutal, it is so tense, and it is all heightened because not only is the choreography so well done, it does really feel quite brutal. There's so many hits that do land that you do feel. The music in that sequence is non-existent. There is no music playing whatsoever within that one tiny fight, and it really does kind of elevate just how tense it actually is. I didn't really talk about the sound design in my review for part one, and I probably should have. Sound effects, Foley, ADR, music, the overall usage of atmosphere and surround sound in these movies, it is absolutely fantastic. Sound design, especially when it comes to sci-fi movies and TV shows, is one of the most important aspects of those projects. It requires a lot of imagination, it requires a lot of out-of-the-box thinking, but it is one of the most creatively rewarding aspects of movie and TV making, especially when it comes to sci-fi movies and TV shows, because you could do anything. The sound design in Dune Part 1 and Part 2 is absolutely incredible. It is one of the most immersive aspects of this entire series. How they use sound in this movie really does kind of bring this world to life a lot more, and it does highlight a lot of aspects about this world. The choices that they've made for a lot of the Foley and a lot of the sound effects in general are absolutely perfect and really do work well for this movie. I'd almost go so far as to say that it's almost on par with things like Star Wars. It's that good. That is one of the reasons why this movie is absolutely absolutely worth checking out in cinemas. You need that surround sound. The sound is absolutely amazing, but equally amazing are the visuals once again. Visually, I don't really know what else I can really say about this one that I didn't already say in my review for part 1. The cinematography for Dune Part 2 is absolutely phenomenal, and I would go so far as to say that there are some sequences in this film that honestly look like works of art. There's even a few sequences that kind of echo things like 2001: A Space Odyssey. There's some really sort of weird trippy visuals that they do go for, and they look incredible. I've also got to be honest and admit that I wasn't really expecting just how much religious imagery was going to be in this either, but it doesn't feel out of place. It works very well within the story, and it helps kind of contextualize what's actually going on. This is how you do it, Zack Snyder. I also really love what it is that they do with colours and colour palettes throughout this movie as well. There's one sequence quite early on which takes place at sunset, so basically everything just looks like orange and yellows and reds, and it looks amazing. And there's no way that I can't mention one of the most visually spectacular sequences from this entire film, and that is a sequence that takes place on Gedi Prime. You've probably seen a little bit of it in the trailers and some of the clips that I've featured in this video, but there is a sequence that takes place on Gedi Prime, which is the homeworld of the Harkonnens. We did see a little bit of it in part 1, but it was all at night time and it was quite stormy and rainy, so we couldn't really see too much of it. This time around, we do get to spend a little bit more time on this planet, and we get to see a little bit more of it. And it turns out that Gedi Prime is actually under a black sun. And essentially what that means is that anytime somebody goes outside during the daytime, all colour just vanishes and it becomes completely monochrome. I don't know if the idea for this originates from the books or whether it was an idea from cinematographer Greg Fraser or director Denis Villeneuve, but whoever's idea it was, honestly, it was such a fantastic decision. Again, when it comes to the costumes, to the set design, to the hair and makeup, it is all absolutely fantastic. Especially the set designs and locations that they have featured in these movies, because it does help ground these films so much more. The Dune movies are very practical. They do everything that they can for real. There are absolutely CG enhancements and visual effects to sort of help things as much as they can, but for the most part they do try and keep it as realistic and grounded as possible, and the reason for them going more practical is to help sell that. It wouldn't make sense to film a movie that predominantly takes place in a desert on a green screen studio. It just wouldn't work. They actually were out in the deserts filming these movies, and honestly it looks so much better because of it. And that includes a lot of the older locations that they do feature in these movies, especially when it comes to like where it is that the Fremen live. That actually does feel like a very lived in place. It does feel like they have been there for a very long time, and it also adds a really good contrast between what's going on with the Fremen on Arrakis and what's going on with the Harkonnens on Gedi Prime. Gedi Prime, the Harkonnens, there is this kind of like look and aesthetic that they have to their costumes and the overall set design, which is quite sleek, dark, black colours that almost echoes things like Hellraiser, especially some of the creatures that appear in this one. And then when it comes to Arrakis and all the people that are living there, like the Fremen, like Paul, Lady, Jessica, Gurney, there is now a very distinct look to them that does show that they have been living there for a little bit of time now. Especially when it comes to somebody like Gurney, for instance, who looks a little bit more rugged and a little bit more roughed up, and all like his armour's all sort of like dusty and everything. Nothing looks as clean and as sleek as it did in part 1. Everything does look a little bit more dustied up and a bit more well worn. Again, it does help sell the believability of this, and I really do appreciate that. Everything that they have done to try and bring this world to life, the environments, the sets, the costumes, all the CG effects and visual effects, the technology that's featured, it does feel believable, it does feel grounded, and it does help sell this even more, and it is absolutely fantastic. And of course this movie does use a lot of visual effects to try and enhance as much as it can. Like the first one, the effects do look really good overall, they do look very believable, and they do go hand in hand with everything that was filmed for real. There's a lot more focus and a lot more emphasis on the sandworms this time around, so there is a lot more of them this time, and honestly they look phenomenal. I don't think they're quite as intimidating as they were in part 1, but it does make sense why. Honestly, everything that everyone working on this movie has done is absolutely incredible, and that also includes the score. Hans Zimmer is back to create the soundtrack for Dune Part 2, and honestly it is fantastic once again. There is some themes that are carried over from part 1, but there is a load of new sounds and a load of new tracks that are introduced in part 2. It's really big once again, it's used very effectively to try and highlight what's going on within each scene. It's used to help build up the tension and establish what is actually going on. It's absolutely fantastic once again, and it still blurs together all of those different elements, like the more synthy sounds as well as that primal drum beat again, which sounds so good in the cinema. And obviously because this movie does have a lot of undertones relating to religion, faith, belief, there is a little bit of an undertone that is in the soundtrack to that as well. There's lots of like little chimes and lots of bells as well. But I love that the soundtrack is being used to highlight as much as it can, including more subtle subtle things as well. There's one track that is played during a sequence that I honestly would have expected to have been a little bit more heroic and a little bit more like triumphant. But it really isn't. It sounds like something out of a horror movie. It sounds like it's signalling that a monster has just arrived. It is such an effective soundtrack, and this is easily one of Hans Zimmer's best to date. If you have never listened to the soundtracks for either Dune movies, I honestly highly encourage you to give them a go. They are absolutely incredible. Overall, this movie is one of the best sci-fi movies that we have had in years. It is a work of art, and I dare say without any exaggeration that this might actually be a masterpiece. The work done with the characters, the performances, the story, the cinematography and sound design, the visual effects, hair and makeup, the sets, locations and the music are absolutely fantastic. The pacing issues from part 1 are fixed. It feels bigger and grander with a much more ambitious scope, but it feels like a natural progression to the story. It deals with complicated themes and concepts in a serious and mature way, and on top of that, it pays off everything set up in part 1 in a very satisfying and sometimes unexpected way, but leaves the door open for more stories in the future. I absolutely loved this movie and will happily say that this is one of the best cinema experiences that I have had in a while. Yes, you do need to see part 1 before seeing this, but even so, this is a must watch. If you can, please see this in IMAX, but if not, try and see it in cinemas. It is designed for the big screen and absolutely worth your time. This movie is absolutely incredible, and with all that being said, my rating for Dune Part 2 is, without question, a 10 out of 10. This was an absolutely incredible experience, and I'm so glad that I got to see this in IMAX, and I'm really looking forward to doing it again. I know director Denis Villeneuve has expressed interest in adapting Dune Messiah, which is the sequel to this book. And you know what? If it is anywhere near as good as these past 2 movies have been, then I am all for it. I really can't wait to see what the future of this franchise has in store. So we'll see what happens. Well, that is pretty much everything I want to say for this video, so if you have watched this video, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe, and be sure to hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that's going on here. If you have seen Dune Part 2, let me know down in the comments what you think about it. Plus, if you have any suggestions for any future Rewind reviews you would like to see me do, let me know down below. But until next time, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. See you guys.